Megan loved old buildings. She loved their musty smells and creaking floorboards. She loved the stories whispered within their walls. So when she discovered Willowmoor Lodge, a secluded inn tucked deep within the woods, she knew she had to stay there. The inn boasted a rich history dating back to the 1800s, and Megan, an amateur historian, couldn't resist its allure. The drive to the lodge was long and winding. The forest pressed in on either side of the narrow road. The sun began to set as Megan finally pulled up to the lodge. The wooden building loomed large in the gathering darkness. Its windows, like vacant eyes, seemed to watch her every move. Despite the unsettling feeling, Megan smiled. This was exactly the kind of adventure she craved. She grabbed her suitcase, eager to explore the lodge and uncover its secrets. As she stepped out of the car, a cold wind whipped through the trees. It carried the scent of pine needles and damp earth, but there was something else too. A faint metallic tang lingered in the air. Megan shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. She walked towards the lodge, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness of the evening. The inside of the lodge was warm and inviting. A fire crackled merrily in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across the room. The air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. A grandfather clock ticked rhythmically in the corner, its pendulum swinging back and forth like a hypnotist's watch. Megan approached the front desk. Behind it stood a frail, elderly woman with a kind smile. Her name tag read, Mrs. Caldwell. "Welcome to Willowmoor Lodge, dear," Mrs. Caldwell greeted, her voice a gentle whisper. "You must be Megan." "Yes, that's right," Megan replied, her apprehension fading with the warmth of the lodge. "We've been expecting you," Mrs. Caldwell said, handing her a heavy iron key. "Your room is at the end of the hallway on the second floor, room 207. Megan thanked her and made her way up the creaking staircase. The hallway was dimly lit, with faded portraits lining the walls. Each one seemed to follow her with their eyes. She reached room 207 and unlocked the door. The room was quaint and cozy, with a four-poster bed and a view overlooking the woods. Megan unpacked her bag, her excitement growing. She couldn't wait to explore the lodge and delve into its history. Over the next few days, Megan spent her time exploring the lodge and the surrounding woods. She found old journals in the attic filled with faded ink and cryptic entries. She learned about the lodge's original owners, a wealthy family who had mysteriously disappeared one stormy night. However, something about the lodge unsettled Megan. It was something about the other guests, or rather the lack of them. Mrs. Caldwell had mentioned that the lodge was fully booked, but Megan had only seen glimpses of a few other people. A man with haunted eyes who always wore a wide-brimmed hat obscuring his face. A young couple who whispered constantly, their faces pale and drawn. Each time Megan tried to get a closer look, they seemed to vanish into thin air, like ghosts. One evening during dinner, Megan decided to ask Mrs. Caldwell about the other guests. Mrs. Caldwell only smiled her enigmatic smile. "Don't you worry, dear," she said, patting Megan's hand. "They keep to themselves, just like you." Megan felt a shiver run down her spine. Mrs. Caldwell's words were far from reassuring. They only deepened the mystery, fueling Megan's unease. Later that night, unable to sleep, Megan found herself drawn to the one room in the lodge that Mrs. Caldwell had strictly forbidden her from entering, the rocking chair room. It was at the end of the hallway, right next to her own room. The door was always locked. Mrs. Caldwell had warned her to stay away, her voice uncharacteristically sharp. Curiosity gnawed at Megan. What was so special about that room? What was Mrs. Caldwell hiding? The hallway was silent. The only sound was the beating of Megan's own heart. She crept towards the forbidden door. Her hand trembled as she reached out to the doorknob. It turned with a soft click. Megan froze, holding her breath. She pushed the door open slowly. The room was shrouded in darkness. She took a step inside. The rocking chair room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle on a small table in the corner. Dust motes danced in the pale light. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else, something metallic. The only furniture in the room was a solitary rocking chair. It faced a large, ornate mirror that took up almost the entire wall. The rocking chair swayed gently as if invisible hands pushed it back and forth. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a cold presence in the room, like something was watching her. Suddenly, a movement in the mirror caught her eye. Megan gasped. A figure had appeared behind her. It was tall and skeletal with long, sharp claws. Its eyes glowed red in the darkness. Megan whirled around, but there was nothing there. She was alone. Had she imagined it? She took a step towards the mirror, her hand outstretched. As she drew closer, the reflection changed. Instead of her own frightened face, she saw the face of Mrs. Caldwell staring back at her. But it wasn't the kind, elderly face Megan knew. This face was twisted and malevolent, with glowing red eyes and a cruel smile. The reflection spoke. "You shouldn't be here, child," it hissed, its voice a low growl. Megan stumbled back in horror. She knew with chilling certainty that this wasn't Mrs. Caldwell. It was something else, something evil, wearing her skin. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind her. Megan spun around to see Mrs. Caldwell standing there, her face now a mask of pure rage. "You weren't supposed to see that," she hissed. Megan's mind raced. She had stumbled upon something sinister, something truly terrifying. She had to get out of the lodge, now. "What's going on?" Megan stammered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" Mrs. Caldwell's smile widened, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. "You know who I am, dear," she purred. "I am the darkness that lingers here, and you, my dear, are going to be a part of it." Panic surged through Megan. She lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. She was trapped. "Let me out of here!" Megan screamed, pounding on the door. "Help!" Mrs. Caldwell laughed, a cold, empty sound that echoed through the room. "No one can hear you, dear," she said. "You are mine now." As Mrs. Caldwell advanced on Megan, her shadow stretched out across the floor, twisting and contorting into monstrous shapes. Megan closed her eyes, bracing herself for the worst. Suddenly, a loud pounding on the front door of the lodge echoed through the house. Mrs. Caldwell froze, her head snapping up, her eyes flashing with annoyance. "Don't move!" she hissed at Megan, her voice dripping with venom. "I'll be back for you!" Mrs. Caldwell hurried out of the room, her footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Megan could hear her downstairs, greeting the new arrival. "Welcome to Willowmoor Lodge," Mrs. Caldwell's voice dripped with forced sweetness. "You must be Mr. Smith." Megan didn't hesitate. This was her chance. She ran to the window and threw it open. The cold night air hit her face like a slap. She didn't have time to think. She had to escape. Megan squeezed through the window and dropped to the ground below. She ran. She didn't look back. Thorns tore at her clothes and branches whipped at her face, but she didn't stop. She could hear Mrs. Caldwell's enraged screams behind her, but they were fading with every step. Megan burst out of the trees and onto the road, her lungs burning, her legs screaming for her to stop. She didn't slow down until she reached her car. Fumbling with the keys, she unlocked the door and threw herself inside. As she sped away, she could see the silhouette of Mrs. Caldwell standing at the edge of the woods, her eyes burning with cold fury. Megan never went back to Willowmoor Lodge, but she never forgot the horror she had experienced there. And sometimes late at night she could still hear Mrs. Caldwell's voice whispering on the wind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that lurked within the walls of the lodge. Meanwhile, back at Willowmoor Lodge, Mrs. Caldwell turned away from the window, a cruel smile spreading across her face. She turned to her new guest, Mr. Smith, his face still hidden in the shadows. Now where were we? she asked, her voice a soft, deadly purr.